afternoon, everybody. I'm going to keep the sort of commercial about Method 180 short, but just at a high level. Method 180 is made up of software licensing experts that really focus on kind of three core things: providing consulting services around looking at software licensing and how to drive cost out of them, assisting organizations through Microsoft audits or SAM engagements. We're going to talk a little bit about some of that at a high level, at least a little later this afternoon, and then also assisting organizations with Microsoft Enterprise agreement negotiation and cost reduction strategies. But I think that the key thing today is why are we really here today? There's a lot of challenge, not just in the petroleum sector, but in a lot of industry out there today. It's getting tough. A lot of people are being asked to do more with less, and unfortunately in a lot of organizations, they've unfortunately had to downsize and are kind of upside down in their contracts with Microsoft. So we're really here to answer the question today: can we downsize our Microsoft Enterprise agreement? So what we've seen, and we've had conversations with a number of clients, is that, I signed up for an enterprise agreement, 2 years ago. We're at 5,000 employees or 5,000 users or desktops or whatever metric, and we've had a reduction in force of 30%, and we really need to cut costs. I've gone to Microsoft and asked them, and they just kind of flat out said no to us. And so to answer that question, the answer really is maybe. And we're going to talk about that today in some depth in terms of the strategies that you can use to open up a negotiation with Microsoft midstream, and in order to kind of right-size or reconstruct your contract. I'm not going to tell you that this is by any means a slam dunk. That's something that can be done, but it's not impossible. It's just it's going to take work, and it's going to take a lot of creativity in order to get Microsoft to open up to having discussions like this. And here's the real reason. Inside of, if you're in a Microsoft Enterprise agreement, they're famous for their true-ups, that ability as you grow every year and add new desktops or users or servers or whatnot, to pay for that true-up on your anniversary date, not to pay for it on your as you deploy it. But the enterprise agreement itself has no standard language around true down. Now, if you're in a subscription agreement with them, like the EA subscription agreement version of it, that does have some annual true down ability, but the enterprise agreement itself does not have true down. In fact, the only language that they have in the contract that kind of alludes to this is a clause around acquisitions, divestitures, and mergers. And really what this, basically in essence says, and I've kind of taken a snapshot of one of their contracts, and this, depending on the organization, this is standard language, but this language has changed slightly, so your contract may have it slightly different, but the essence of it has been consistent within Microsoft for a number of years, and that is if you divest or acquire, something that's going to grow your organization or shrink your organization by 10% as a result of an acquisition or a divestiture or a merger, then Microsoft will work with you in good faith. And they don't really define what good faith is, but really what this is, stating is it has to be a result of some sort of M&A activity in order for them to allow you to work with them in good faith. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but really this clause, if you were looking at the contract itself to say, okay, can we actually decrease our counts, may or may not be leverageable, and that really depends on what activity has occurred. So if it was just, a downsizing due to organic layoffs or whatnot, those unfortunate type events, then Microsoft would just say no to this language. If you just have the standard language, if you worked with us in the past, this is one of the clauses that we highly recommend that organizations negotiate with Microsoft to get this, expanded so that it's beyond just kind of M&A activity. But if you're sitting with the standard language, the reality is from a legal perspective or a contract perspective, you can't pull this up. And so then, or pull this, up as a reason for Microsoft to open up to a discussion. And so one of my clients said to me, okay, then Mike, why don't I just go ahead and cancel my agreement and go for a new negotiation with Microsoft. So we'll just cancel it and we won't pay it. They still had their second and third year payments. And the reality is, that doesn't really work, because the termination clause within the agreement, which I've got pasted here in this slide, basically says that you can cancel the contract, but the key part is that last little part where it says, well, we won't accept any new enrollments under the master agreement, but any existing enrollment will continue for the term of that enrollment. So even though you cancel the agreement, all it's saying is that you can't sign a new enrollment underneath it, but you're still on the hook for any existing payments and things like that. So this clause in and amongst itself isn't very helpful either in terms of trying to open up that conversation with Microsoft, because just by terminating the contract, your obligations to pay and do true-ups or whatnot still exist. And so the next thing, this client said to me, he says, Mike, we actually have Office 365 in our agreement. We made the transition a year ago when we signed this thing, so we can decrease those at least. So I can't touch my Windows servers or my SQL servers that I have, because those are perpetual licenses that don't have a true down. Even my Windows desktop OS and some of the Cal stuff we have, we can't decrease on. But I can decrease my Office 365 counts, right? And the answer there was maybe. And the reason that it was maybe is, so if you look in the contract itself, it says that you can do subscription license reductions, but if it was in number one, part of what Microsoft determines an enterprise-wide purchase, then you can only decrease to the amount that you signed at the start of the contract. So let's just take this to and explain what this really means. Microsoft, in an enterprise agreement, categorizes products in one of two ways. They categorize them as enterprise or additional products. And the enterprise products are Office, the Windows Desktop OS, and the Core Cal or eCal or the Bridge Cals that maybe go with that. Everything else is what they consider an additional product. And the difference is, enterprise, you have to license for all devices or all users, whereas additional products, you can just license for subsets of your use and use, select licenses or older L-only that maybe you have sitting out there, that's not in use. As long as you have enough licenses to cover your deployments, you're fine. But that enterprise purchase makes it so that it's, all users or all devices. So basically, in essence, these guys signed for about 5,000 users. They had unfortunately downsized to about 3,000. And so what this says here is that they can't go down below what they originally signed up for if it was an enterprise-wide purchase. So in the world of Office 365, if you have an E3 user subscription license, for instance, on an enterprise-wide purchase where all users have that, you can't decrease below what you originally signed for. So in this case, they couldn't go below 5,000. So if they trued up or kind of growing, let's say they were in their second year of their contract, and they grew from 5,000 to 6,000 in the first year and went up to 6,000, and then we're coming up on their third year payment and we're down to 3,000, they could only go down to 5,000. So they could go from 6 to 5, but they couldn't go to 3, and that's basically what the contract says here. And so if it was purchased so that it was not part of an enterprise license-wide purchase, then the number 2 here says that can be reduced as long as the initial order minimum requirements are maintained. Now, Microsoft doesn't really spell out what the minimum order requirements are here, but that's usually well known to be 250. So in that case, let's say that you had what Microsoft deems to be a user profile. Let's say you were still doing some perpetual on-premise licenses with Office and a Core Cal, and you had some users with the Office 365 E3. Because the E3 wasn't an enterprise commitment, you could reduce here to the minimum, which is likely 250 in this case. If it was done as an additional product, then those subscription licenses could actually be reduced to 0. And so the E-plans typically Microsoft tries to keep those as enterprise as part of their standard licenses, but this would be if you made a purchase, say, of just Exchange Online, Skype Online, or SharePoint Online, and you just made that as an additional product, you could actually take that down to 0. So again, the answer is if your contract is sitting with Office 365, you can decrease, but it really depends on where you sit in this structure here. So if it was an enterprise-wide committed product, say like E3 across the board, I could decrease, but only to what I signed up initially for. If it wasn't across the board, I can go to the minimum, which is likely 250. If it was added as an additional product, it could go to 0. Now, if you have what they call the add-ons with Office 365, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on Office 365 licensing today, but I know this is a big area of concern for a lot of people. I did do a webinar on Office 365 licensing that you can find under the Method 180 YouTube channel that talks about the different part numbers and stuff. But if you did what they call add-ons, where I had Office as a perpetual license and I added Office 365 on top of that, those add-ons are typically considered an additional product. So you could at least, decrease those to 0 programmatically. And so, right now I'm just talking about what you can do programmatically. So the unfortunate news is, within the construct of the Microsoft contract, if you didn't negotiate any of these clauses, and again, even on these clauses, we make suggestions when we're working with our clients that they try and negotiate some of this language because, Microsoft promotes Office 365 as a cloud product, and holding you to minimum commitments or to what you signed up for really isn't the way that cloud is perceived to work out there. It's kind of Microsoft's interpretation of how cloud licensing works. The idea is to kind of go up and down monthly based on use in most scenarios, but with Microsoft it's annual, and they kind of limit, especially in that enterprise-wide purchase, how far you can go down. So, the question you might be asking is, okay, so what's the point if Microsoft has a rock-solid contract against us? I'm not going to be able to do anything. And, the reality is what I'm here to tell you today, and like I said, this isn't easy. It is definitely something that can be done, but it's not going to be a simple, I call up my Microsoft account rep and say we want to decrease our accounts by 1,000 users, and they're just going to do it. You have to look at this as a negotiation, right? And you have to approach it from that perspective with them, because if it is a negotiation, everything can be negotiated. In fact, they would do the exact opposite to you. They'd be happy to come to you in year 2, and, if you grew and got you to sign a new deal for another 3 years. So, we know that they will negotiate on these types of things, but it is definitely a negotiation. And I will tell you, it will be simpler depending on where you are in your contract stream. If you're, kind of in year 1, and year 2, it's going to be a lot more difficult than if you've made your third payment. So even if you made your third payment, say, last month, you're probably in a lot easier position to negotiate this with Microsoft, because you can kind of do okay, we've made our final payment on the contract, and then we want to open this up to negotiation for a new 3-year term at, lower quantities or whatnot. And so that one would be a lot easier than if you were in year 1 or year 2. Not impossible. And when I say year 3, I'm talking, you're not 2-3 months away from renewal. I'm talking you're coming up, you just made a payment 2 months ago. You can do this probably with a lot more ease than if you're in that first or second year. Again, the first or second year, it's possible. It's just going to be, you're going to have to really think through a negotiation strategy with Microsoft on, how do we accomplish this, and what can we do, okay? So I think one of the key things is, if it's a negotiation, always understanding, the other side of the table is important. So understanding the psychology of the account team, what's going on at Microsoft, and what you're up against. So, typically what would happen, and we have, worked with some clients in these sorts of scenarios, and their approach was to approach their Microsoft account team, their sales rep, basically say, hey, we're under some pressures, we'd like to restructure our agreement, and they really came up against, kind of that brick wall, and they weren't able to kind of move the negotiations. And, really what it boils down to is, here's what it comes to. Microsoft is all about growth. Your account reps, regardless of industry, regardless of what's going on in the economy, are probably facing 15 to 20% year-over-year quota growth. So if, your account spent $1 million last year, even if you're in an industry that's not growing, they're probably facing, 1.5, 1.2, maybe even a little bit more on their quota this year. And so that typically, where do they typically get growth when you were in an EA, was either through those true-ups or through net new product adds. So some of the things that they've always done around selling you, upgrades from the core cal to eCal in the past, maybe getting you to add Office 365, at least on a subset of users if you're currently not in that agreement. What I didn't put in this slide that they do quite a bit of is, with just general licensing changes. So, the announcements that they recently made with Windows Server moving from processor to core. More on that in a little bit here, but those are the ways that they typically would come at getting growth. And so none of those are really going to work in the type of economic climate that we're in today. So that, those sort of things aren't working, right? So, I always say to people, if you as a company are trying to decrease your accounts, it's likely that if an account rep has 10 accounts that, 5, 6, 7, 8 more of them are trying to figure out the same thing. How do we decrease our spend? And it's not, it's not that we're trying to consume less of Microsoft's technology. We just have fewer people and less desktops and all that stuff. And so, they're in a tough spot where they're facing growth in your account and across their account base, and at the same time, all of their accounts are coming to them, trying to figure out ways to decrease their spend. And so that just makes it very, very difficult. And so I think that understanding some of the behaviors that we'll see out of your sales reps that, when they're not going to make their number become important, because what happens at Microsoft are things that I call soft metrics start to really become, crucial to them. When they realize that they're not going to be able to make their quota, they're going to go after other business objectives that Microsoft has put on them in order to, at least look like they've accomplished something in the territory this year. And this is where, when you open up to a negotiation with them, this is where maybe if you can think about ways that you can do some of these sorts of things, that they might be open to that conversation. This is where it really kind of, helps. So what are those soft metrics? Deployment is key. I mean, actually, I think that's become one of the key metrics at Microsoft this year. So, it used to be one thing to sell you a product, say Office 365 or Azure. We used to see contracts 2 years ago, 3 years ago, where those products were just put in there, but, clients never really consumed them. They just kind of bought them because Microsoft gave, a few extra points discount, and it really was net zero, and so we took it. Actual consumption and deployment of that stuff is becoming really important. So if you think about where Microsoft as a company is strategically going around things like Office 365, Azure, the cloud type stuff, even, what I'll call voice-enabled unified communication seats. So that's kind of the Skype for Business Plus, or, their E5 if you're familiar with that from the Office 365. Those are key technologies that Microsoft is pushing. So deployments of those could potentially be traded off or offset for opening up a discussion. The other thing that they really, push and tout quite a bit is product displacement, so rip and replace a competitor. Even if sometimes you tell them, look, I can't do that. We had a client where they approached them with very similar situations. This was a couple of years back, actually, but very similar. We were able to get them to open up to the negotiations, but what Microsoft wanted was, at the time, they wanted the Link Plus Cal added into the agreement. And even though this client was in an area where a lot of their remote branches couldn't even use the technology, the bandwidth issues that they had going out to those regions the technology wouldn't work. They kept pushing that, right? So they really are big on this rip and replace. So sometimes when you look at the dollars and cents on some of these things, maybe there's an opportunity for as part of the negotiation to, decrease count, is to potentially offer up a product where you can offset, maybe you can reduce Office by $1 million, take on a couple of $100,000 worth of maybe Skype for Business Plus, and kind of, suggest that maybe you might do some pilots and stuff like that if you can get to those. So, these are the sorts of things that they become very interested in. One of the things that I didn't put in here that really becomes a big leverage point that, I think is important to talk about is that access to executives in your organization can be seen as key wins for them. So, for instance, a lot of the time Microsoft is selling into the IT organization. They may or may not have a relationship with your CIO, depending on, there's just, I guess, the general relationship with your organization. So sometimes access to the CIO could work, but some other times access to other key executives may work, such as the CFO. So you can kind of maybe play off on some relationship stuff where we can get you access to the CFO, where the CFO can tell you directly why it's important that Microsoft be a good partner and partner up and help us, with our cost here, and, get access to, give them access to a meeting with the CFO. And so as much as that may seem like it's something that's simple, it's definitely something that plays very well to Microsoft because they feel that's key to them going forward. And so one of the things that I always say is if you kind of look at, you want to open this up to a negotiation with Microsoft, it really is kind of this triangle approach between kind of three departments, and this is really what you need to sit down and figure out your strategy if you're going to try and open up that discussion because you're in year 1 or 2. Year 3, I'll talk about that in a second because I do think that one's slightly easier. But if we're talking about somebody that's in the first or second year of their contract and wants to open up that negotiation with Microsoft, you really should try and leverage each of these three components. The IT department should leverage the relationships that you've developed with Microsoft over time. And when I say relationships that you've developed with Microsoft over time, I don't necessarily mean your relationship just with your account team, so your sales rep or even their manager. A lot of the times these discussions may need to take place at higher levels, regional vice president or something to that nature, depending on the size of the organization, of your organization. So, you really want to leverage those relationships, pull out the cards from the times that you've gone down to Redmond to executive briefings and, which executives did you get an opportunity to meet or did your senior leaders get a chance to meet, and leverage those things because that, like I said, opening up the conversation above your account team. You got to remember, your account team, let's just say they have 10 accounts. They're going to carry a quota of, somewhere between 12 and 15 million, maybe some of the bigger territories up to 20. If you're a couple of $1 million, that's 20%, and you want to reduce your spend by 500,000, 600,000. That's a large percentage of your account rep's quota. But the higher you go up, the more these guys carry. You get up into regional vice presidents that are hundreds of millions, or in some of the bigger regions, even $1 billion. The $500,000 that you want to change, or even if it's a couple $1 million, really is a rounding error to them. So that's where you can take those deployment opportunities that I talked about around maybe doing some pilots on Azure or Office 365 if you're not there, or piloting some seats on the voice-enabled UC, even Power BI and some of their newer technologies. If you can make some concessions there where you can do that, those things really play off a lot more to those senior executives because dollars and cents at a single individual account level really don't move the needle for them on those big, hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of revenue that they're responsible for. But if you're a large organization and you go and say, geez, we could do a pilot of 5,000 seats of Office 365, and we would look at doing that over time, but we could potentially get there. That probably plays a lot more weight to them because the number of seats of Office 365 that they need to get into agreements and started to deploy will be much smaller, so that's a bigger percentage. So that's where those items on the other slide really play in. Even when you talk to those about your account manager, getting those up the chain, the visibility where they become much more important is important, right? So when it comes to procurement, this is what you really want to play off kind of the financial language with them. Why is it important for the organization to downsize? That you're challenged with TCO or ROI this year. Even maybe go into some of the impacts that maybe it has on an earnings per share level. And really what the language that you want to be speaking to them out of procurement and finance is really all around strategic partnerships, right? So I like to tell stories, and I had a client that I'm actually working with right now, and they're in an audit with Microsoft, and they don't have an enterprise agreement. And I said, let's have some fun with Microsoft and go and ask them exactly what Microsoft considers a strategic relationship. And the answer back, I kid you not, you can't make this stuff up, was that they're an enterprise agreement customer. So it really didn't have anything to do with deploy Office 365 or Azure or do this great thing with Dynamics CRM or whatnot. was doing EA. So really what you want to do is throw back to them strategic partnership, talk to them a lot about that, how, you know, in the good times you've grown with them, you want to continue to be a good partner with them, you want to continue to use their technologies, but now Microsoft needs to partner with you guys and open this thing up to reductions in counts or restructuring the agreement altogether to get you guys in a better position. And then obviously it becomes important to leverage kind of legal, you know, for two things. One is, you know, those two clauses that I threw out earlier can be leveraged. You know, even the mergers and acquisition or the 10% divestitures clause, even though it doesn't specifically say, you know, that if due to, you know, layoffs, you may be able to leverage that and get legal to, you know, throw some language into a letter to Microsoft that says we're leveraging this clause and says you'll work with us in good faith and we want to open up these conversations. So you really want to definitely, you know, consider that as a strategy to get them to open up and talk. But on the other side of the coin as well, let's assume that they are open to some discussions. You know, you kind of leverage some of your relationships in IT. You've sort of made some, you know, loose commitments on maybe doing some things that you know will hit with their scorecards, and they've opened up to negotiation. We want to make sure that two things. One, if times get better and you're growing, that you don't lose your commitments that you made in software before. So, you know, a great example is we own 5,000 copies of Office, all covered under SA. We want to take that down to 4,000. Therefore, we're going to have 1,000 that aren't covered under SA anymore, and then we add 1,000 people 2 years from now. I don't want to be buying L and SA again, so how can we protect that? There's definitely some strategies that you can develop around how you would negotiate that in there. And so, you know, leveraging that as well as taking a look at that clause around mergers and acquisition and blowing that out next time so that you are open to the ability to go and renegotiate with them much more easily. And so that all comes down to how that conversation can play out. So really, you know, kind of in order to open this up, like I said, this is going to be a negotiation. If you want to go after them to reduce your count in year 1, year 2, you really have to think of it as a negotiation. You really want to think through a plan of how do we leverage kind of all three of these functions within our organization to, you know, get Microsoft to open up to that. I am going to take just a second and talk about if you've already made your third-year payment, or even if you're kind of close to it, a couple months out from it, why I think it's a little bit easier. So the one thing that the enterprise agreement is with the exception of true-ups, it's prepay for the year. And so what do I mean by that? Let's just use January 1st as your anniversary date on your contract. January 1st, you pay for the entire year for that annual commitment. And then on the true-up, you know, kind of December time frame, you do your true-up for stuff that you consume during the year. And so if you're about to make your third payment or you've already made your third payment, you've paid for the third year. So when you go and try and negotiate with Microsoft and you've already paid for the third year, what they won't do is they won't necessarily, you know, say, okay, you paid us $2 million January 1st, we'll credit that $2 million back and now you'll pay 1.5. And, you know, in essence, we'll give you 500,000 back in that example. They're not going to do that, but they'll be much more open to, okay, you know what, let's cancel the contract, let's sign a new 3-year term, and let's start that with that new baseline of 1.5, and we owe you some credits of 500,000, so maybe the first year is, you know, 1 million, and then it's 2 and 2. And there's some math that goes into this so that you don't overpay, because I think as I'm thinking through this at a high level, I'm kind of not illustrating this properly. But, you know, the first year really is 0 because you paid 1.5. The second year would be 1 million because there's a 500,000 credit left. The third year would be 2 million. So you can do, you know, you can do things like that where that really helps because now you've pulled off budget for the next payments, depending on where you are in your financial calendar. That can come out of this year. So there's definitely a lot easier ways to do this if you're in the third year because that third payment's been made, not where, you know, it's sitting on the books at $2 million and now you want to take it down to $1.5 million. Okay. So I did talk about, you know, about a bunch of this. I'm just going to touch on a couple of other things. If you're looking at things that you can give them. Obviously, Office 365 is big for them, even if you're not looking at deployment. The one thing that I would say is be careful. Maybe go take a listen to that webinar on the YouTube channel about Office. There's two ways you can buy it, user subscriptions and add-ons. User subscriptions are what you think about Office 365 as being. That's turn my Office licenses into subscriptions, versus the add-ons, which are keep my perpetual licenses, add Office 365 on the top of it. And so there's some benefits and disadvantages to both of those, and I think Microsoft does not talk about the add-ons very often. I think that they're way underutilized, and they're definitely something we highly recommend to our clients to leverage. And so if you are thinking about it, you really want to investigate user subscriptions versus add-ons. In fact, one client that we were working with just recently had an Office 365 deal. They were looking to renew that. They were going to go all to user subscriptions, and we actually showed them that the add-on approach, we could save them quite a bit of money. I think we ended up saving them about 32% over 3 years by going the add-on approach versus moving straight to subscriptions, and that really has to do with the add-ons. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Back to that enterprise product that I talked about before. So, kind of think through those sorts of things. The other thing that you can potentially offer them if you have any of these things, and again, when I talk about a competitive win with Microsoft, it's not, rip our Cisco environment out and put in Skype, okay? What I mean is, Microsoft knows that you're Cisco, maybe you're, Link or Skype on the front end for IM messaging, but, your whole back-end infrastructure, your PBX is Cisco. You don't plan on ripping and replacing that. But maybe there's an area where you can do a small pilot, which would be seen as a win to Microsoft, and maybe it's not too disruptive to you to do that. And so you can look at giving them those small competitive wins in a couple of those areas where, potentially they can see that as a win, and that would be a reason for them to go back to the business and say, we're gonna open this agreement up, okay? And so, one of the things that as I said, it's a negotiation, but, the key to winning this is really to be prepared. And what do I mean by that? You really need to review your deployments and your user counts, because what I see a lot of the times is, organizations are at 5,000 in their current agreement. They go to Microsoft and say, we're down 1,000. And, Microsoft internally is skeptical of that stuff always, regardless of what news is out there. They're skeptical of that. And so if you kind of go to them and say, well, we have an EA for 5,000 users, but we're now at 3,988, and you have your exact numbers, and we've gone from 5,000 desktops to 4,214, that sounds so much more realistic to them, like so much more credible because it's an actual number. And so don't just use round numbers, we're down by 1,000, we're down by 1,021 people. So make sure you understand your count. Make sure you understand how you're using the products as well, because, if you're going to have an opportunity to restructure, the one thing that they may not allow you to do is say, you know what, we don't want to renew Office anymore because we own 2016 and we'll eventually move to Office 365, but we're not going to buy that now, and you're really shrinking that spend. They're probably not going to let something like that happen, but they would potentially be open to that, go from 5,000 to 4,000, and decrease your spend. But you really want to understand your usage of products. And the reason that I say this is, although they won't let you structure it that way, maybe there are things that you can do in how you're buying that can be leveraged in year 2 or year 3 to decrease cost in case things don't change. And so a great example of that might be we're not ready to go to Office 365. We don't want to go to E3 because we don't want to get stuck with it as an enterprise product. But you know what? We'll move our Office licenses to the Office 365 version of Office, because that's a subscription and an additional product, and we can reduce that to 0 next year. So there might be, you might want to be thinking through these things in terms of not just the short 1-year strategy on what do we do to renew this, but this is what I mean, understanding that product usage, because you may be able to do things that drop the cost this year and then significantly drop the cost next year if structured properly. So think through how you're using it and how, what you can potentially do, not just in this year, but potentially, year 2 and year 3 if the situation doesn't change. Okay, and you'll hear me talk quite a bit if you've been on any of my other webinars or seen me present anywhere. I always talk about the fact knowing what you don't need is more important than knowing what you do need with Microsoft. Their whole strategy around bundling is just a great example of that. You take Office 365. I want to buy E3. Why? We want to deploy Exchange to the cloud. Okay, that's great. You want Exchange Online, right? You don't need E3. You need Exchange Online. And so understanding that really becomes important if you are going to open these things up and try and renegotiate with them. So I wanted to actually use, this is a real example of a client. We have a tool that we use that actually goes in and analyzes their Office 365 environment. And this one happened to be lucky in that their Office 365 purchase was add-ons. It was not the subscription, so it was considered an additional product. They'd actually thought that they had deployed Office 365 to quite a bit, and it's really, kind of hard to see here, but basically if you looked here, they were subscribed, this is a big organization, to over 75,000 of these, and they were only using a couple of thousand. So they'd actually only had a couple of thousand users enabled on Office 365. And so when we were able to go to them and show them that you can decrease these counts with confidence, knowing your users, because what I don't have a screenshot of is, this process that we use to go in and analyze Office 365 consumption. We can actually show them what users are using it, which products in Office 365, whether it's just Exchange, whether it's SharePoint, whatnot. So we can show them what usage is out there. We were able to basically show them that they could drop 75,000 times about $20 per year for this add-on that they were paying. And so that was a relatively significant savings, about $1.5 million, and that was all contractual. But again, that comes back to they didn't know what they didn't know. They thought that Office 365 was deployed wider than it truly was, or was being adopted wider than it truly was. When we went in and analyzed that, we were able to show them that it truly wasn't. And they were able to do that with ease, right, because that was coming up to their anniversary. We were, I think, about 3 months ahead of it. And we were able to show them, look, you can just drop that down. Your unit price is locked in. We're not going to zero, so it's still there. And if you deploy more, you can kind of do that through the reservation or kind of the Office 365 true-up process next year and not have to worry about it. So this is just a great example of how you can use that data. In this case, it was very simple to pull $1.5 million out of their contract without having to do a negotiation with Microsoft. And so the next question that I get asked is, okay, I've gone to Microsoft, I've approached them, I said I want to do this. We've decreased our counts, but if I do this, am I really opening myself up to an audit? And so I think what's important to note is here's what we believe the top triggers for audit to be: zero true up or no growth. When an organization doesn't true up, they get flagged. Mergers or acquisitions are big ones, divestitures. Obviously, decreasing your spend with Microsoft or not renewing software assurance. So regardless of the industry or of what's going on in the industry today, if you're on this call and interested about reducing your enterprise agreement, in short, you're probably already on their radar for an audit. And it's nothing that you've done. It's just how they flag and pull numbers internally, because if you're going through tough economic times and need to renegotiate your contract, it's likely you have a zero true-up, which is a flag. Over there, we see that all the time. It's zero true-up, and you're going to get audited. In fact, not renewing software assurance. I'm working with a client. We just finished their EA renewal in December, and they were going through some tough times, and we came up with some strategies to decrease the amount of software assurance that they were purchasing on products. SQL being a big one. They had a large infrastructure of SQL that was a physical environment. It was all running. When we analyzed their SQL environment, 2012 and 2014 was running on less than 6% of their databases. Everything else was 2008 R2 and earlier. They had no plans to really upgrade a lot of the infrastructure, even though they had some that were unsupported, like 2005 on the SQL side. The applications themselves couldn't be upgraded. So the value of software assurance was just diminished for them. And so where they really required it was for the rights that are built into software assurance, server mobility in a virtual environment, right? So when a VM moves from server 1 to server 2, they needed to have the ability for the license to follow it. And so we were able to decrease their SQL spend by 70%. Now, this was a large SQL client. It was 7 figures of SQL spend. And as soon as Microsoft, saw that they were not renewing the software assurance, in December they told them, we're auditing you in March. And so, these guys really, knew that that was happening. In fact, they didn't say they were auditing them. They called it a SAM, or a Software Assurance Management Agreement, which really, or Software Assurance SAM engagements, right? A little tongue-tied there. So, SAM, if they do use those words, hey, we want to check your deployments, and that's okay, we'll do this, but we want you to run map, and we want to look at your deployments, SQL or Windows or whatnot. Know that a SAM is an audit in disguise. It really, the main difference is penalties. And so what do I mean by that is with an audit, if they found you to be 5% or greater non-compliance, they can charge you list plus 10% as a penalty. You could pay for auditor fees and all that. Whereas with SAM, Microsoft funds the partner to come in and do the engagement, and you just pay under your normal true-up or whatnot, so there's no penalty. Other than that, really what they do from the time they're in the door is exactly the same in both of them. So it really is around penalties, okay? So I do get asked quite a bit, in these sorts of cases, even if you aren't looking to renegotiate, you just know that we're not growing, we're not going to have a true-up. So what can you do to protect yourself from an audit? I think one of the key things is know what your contract says you can and can't do, right? And so, understanding, can I decrease my counts here, say with Office 365 as a subscription product? I've got a server and cloud enrollment. Do I really need to true up SQL servers because I own some old licenses? The answer is yes, but those are the sorts of things that you really want to be watching for. Really understand how licenses are counted, understand that difference between enterprise and additional products that I talked about earlier. But, the other thing that I would say is if you weren't taking advantage of them, look for the clauses in your contracts that you can. And so what do I mean by that? For instance, if you are in an EA with desktop, Office, or the Windows OS, you may be able to leverage the industry device clause where you may be able to remove certain desktops from your counts if they're dedicated to a single industry device. A great example would be a POS system at a retailer, clinical PC that's on a clinical cart in a hospital. In the oil and gas world, process machines that are watching, oil drill pressure in a well or whatnot. So you can really look at what industry devices have we excluded. Are there others that we potentially could include? And so that's one way maybe potentially if you did have to do a true-up to avoid that, right? The other thing that I would say is, much like the client that I just talked about, although we save them substantial on the renewal, they're concerned with, the SAM engagement that Microsoft's putting them under in March. And so, we're teaching them to go through the process of the audit now to get ahead of it and see, in their deployment data, is there anything to be worried about? So understand that they are going to look at your Active Directory and your LDAP and see which devices and users are active out there. They're going to run scripts. They're going to want to use this map toolkit. So understand that sort of stuff. Run it in your environment, and get all that data ahead of time so that you can take a look at it and understand it and have already built your stories. We have 5,000 PCs, but we've excluded 6,032 of them, or 632 of them, because they're industry device clauses. Here's what we determined to be an industry device clause. Here's the name Microsoft, and just turn the data over to them if they do a SAM and say, okay, hey, that's great. Here you go. We've already prepped this stuff, and will you just accept this? We worked with one really large oil and gas company. They had over almost 100,000 employees, maybe a little bit more actually. And, they had an auditor in, and we were able to actually head off the auditor. They were signing NDAs. We got in a few weeks ahead, did a self-assessment for them and with them, and handed the data over, and they called off the audit and just accepted it. So you can do those sorts of things, okay? So I did say I would allude a little bit. Microsoft has changed the licensing for Windows Server 2016. They've announced that that's changed to core-based licensing. The next webinar that I'm going to run is actually going to talk about the licensing changes there. Microsoft's come out and said that it's net neutral to clients. We actually believe it's about a 43% price increase in disguise. We had about a 50,000, I think it was about 50,000 servers in some of the inventory tools that we had that we analyzed, and it really is looking like it's about 43% license increase since the 2012 licensing changes. And so we're going to talk about, what the changes are, what your rights are, what you can and can't do, and how to avoid some of those how to build strategies to avoid the licensing impacts there. But this is a great example, whereas if you're looking to renegotiate with Microsoft, here's an opportunity to go to them and say, look, we're really concerned with the 2016 license changes. We'd like to sign a new 3-year term so that we have 3 years to get prepared for them, and use this as a leverage to open up your negotiation with them, potentially, right, if it makes sense for you. And so, it's just a great example of everything with Microsoft's negotiable, because, again, they would come to you, and I don't doubt that they're going to start coming to you prior to, or to companies prior to, these changes being in effect, and say, hey, your contract's not up till next year, but if we sign a new 3-year term now, we can avoid the changes to Windows Server for 3 years. So leverage that. Use that as a leverage point with them to open up your negotiations. So that's really what I wanted to get across today. Here's a few different ways that you can get a hold of me if you've got any questions. Sean, I do think I saw a couple pop up. If you want to ask those, I can maybe spend the next couple of minutes answering questions. But feel free to reach out to me either by phone or email, or if you want to follow me, I'm Austin MIK. At Twitter, if you want, I usually tweet a couple of little tidbits a day on Microsoft. So, Sean, you want to ask a couple of questions? Or?
Yeah, we do have a couple of folks who have PM'd me some questions, and I guess one question, I'm going to kind of paraphrase it here, is they were asking if Microsoft, I think they're referring to the last bit you were explaining there about kind of a Windows Server and kind of increasing the term in a negotiation. And what they're asking is, would Microsoft be open to trading term for a reduction in desktops? What I think they're saying is, would Microsoft be open to a renegotiation in terms of adding additional years onto the agreement at a reduced desktop count?
I absolutely believe that is a good way to open it up to them, is reduce counts for increased term. I do think that they'll do that, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying, especially if you're in kind of late second, early part of third year. That's definitely a lot easier than if you're in the first 6 months of the contract. But I do think that they will trade off term for reduced desktop counts. The challenge is going to be, they're not going to want to do reduced revenue, right? And so that's the key when it comes to negotiation. But what I always say to people is, you want to get them open up to that conversation when they say, yeah, we'll redo this contract, and then you can negotiate price and things like that. But I do believe that is definitely a key thing where they will potentially trade off term for reduced desktop counts. And, especially if you can convince them that if they don't, you're not going to renew, or you're going to really be looking at how to reduce your strategies. And that sort of goes to that be prepared, understanding, what you don't need, what you do need, what your roadmap plans would look like, which may be tough right now, but if you understand that and you can go to them and convince them, look, if you guys don't play ball with us now, a year from now or 18 months from now when this thing's up for renewal, you guys are, you're in real trouble, and we're not going to do strategic things with you around, Office 365 or whatnot.
Okay, that's great. The next question I've got is, you've talked about some really big customers in terms of the examples. I've only got a few thousand seats in my environment. Is this relevant to me?
Yeah, I don't believe size. Now, I should paraphrase. I should correct myself. If you're a couple hundred users, this would be a lot more difficult. But if you're in over 1,000 users, you definitely can do these things. And the numbers are relevant, right? So even though you may not be spending $5 million a year, if you were $5 million, could save 20. That's $1 million in savings. If you're $1 million a year and spend with them and are going to save 20. It's a couple $100,000. That's all relevant to your budget, right? So I absolutely believe that smaller organizations can do this. In fact, the one that we helped was, I want to say, about 2,100 users. So, you can definitely do this in smaller organizations. And in fact, sometimes it's actually a little bit easier to do it in smaller organizations because the dollars aren't as big and they don't impact account reps or territories as much as pulling a few $1 million out. So absolutely, I think you can do it. If you put the right strategies in place, regardless of size, you can have success trying these sorts of things.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We've got one last question here, and that is, my company's experienced significant layoffs. Does it make sense to have someone from HR in the room when I meet with Microsoft?
I would say in that case I would probably, I mean, it wouldn't hurt, you know, if you think that Microsoft isn't going to believe you or trust the numbers or whatnot. I can't see how it would hurt. I would actually suggest, though, turning that a little bit and maybe bringing somebody senior from finance in to talk about the impact on, you know, overall, you know, earnings per share or something like that, and putting it back to them around the financial health of the organization versus pinpointing it from an HR perspective. But it wouldn't hurt. But I think you can maybe make it a little bit more powerful bringing in somebody from finance.
Okay, that's great. I think that's all the questions we had for today. So I just wanted, before everyone jumps, I just wanted to thank everyone for their time today. Mike's contact information is up on the screen today. We're always happy to have a conversation to see if there's an opportunity that we can help. And we'll be in touch regarding future webinars. And we will have this webinar up unloaded for repeat viewing on our website at method180.com, probably within about 48 hours. So with that, thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.